The cafe gleamed like a jewel amid the bustling streets of Zavros Prime, its iridescent sign shimmering with an otherworldly elegance. Nora Ellis pushed the door open and stepped inside, the soft chime of the entrance bell barely audible over the low hum of conversation. The air was thick with a mix of exotic aromas, spices from distant star systems and the sharp tang of Zavran nectar. She paused, taking it all in. It had been years since she had stepped foot on an alien world, and though she had seen her share of strange places, there was always something unnerving about being the only human in the room. Nora adjusted the worn, dark coat draped over her shoulders and moved toward the counter. The coat was utilitarian, a relic from her years in the Terran military. Its edges were frayed, and the patches on the sleeves told a silent story of battles fought and survived. She liked the weight of it, even though it marked her as an outsider among the sleek, metallic fashions of the aliens around her. Behind the counter stood a tall Zavran male, his glossy crimson skin catching the light. His posture was immaculate, his movements precise as he prepared a drink with a flourish. Nora noticed his expression as she approached, an imperceptible flicker of disdain that might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't spent decades reading body language in tense negotiations and hostile encounters. "What can I get for you?" the Zavran asked, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. His name tag read Troll. He didn't meet her eyes, instead focusing on wiping a spotless surface. "Just a plain black coffee," Nora said, her voice calm and steady. She knew better than to rise to unspoken challenges. "Nothing fancy." Troll's ridged brow lifted, and his lips curved into a thin smile. "Black coffee? Primitive, but I suppose we can manage." He didn't bother hiding the smirk. Nora's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to smile. "Thanks." The Zavran turned away with deliberate slowness, his movements exaggerated as if the task of brewing coffee were beneath him. He muttered something under his breath in his native tongue, and a faint ripple of laughter came from two other Zavran workers behind the counter. Nora didn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. The tone said enough. She stepped aside to wait for her order, her eyes scanning the room. The cafe was a study in alien opulence, its walls lined with bioluminescent panels that pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic glow. The patrons were predominantly Zavran, their elegant, angular forms draped in shimmering fabrics that caught the light with every movement. They spoke in low, melodic voices, their tones carrying an air of effortless superiority. Nora suddenly felt the weight of her coat, its sturdy fabric out of place among the flowing garments. Her gaze landed on a table near the corner, where a young alien couple sat whispering to each other. The female glanced at Nora and then leaned in closer to her companion, her expression one of faint amusement. Nora straightened her back, resisting the urge to adjust her coat or smooth her hair. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She just wanted a decent cup of coffee. "Here you go," Troll said, placing a cup on the counter with a faint clink. Nora turned and reached for it, only to hesitate when she saw the cup. The liquid inside was lukewarm at best, with an oily sheen on its surface. The chipped rim of the mug looked as though it had seen better days. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. "This doesn't seem right. Could you?" "It's fine," Troll interrupted, his smile now openly condescending. "Humans have simpler tastes. It should be adequate." A murmur of amusement passed through the nearby patrons. Nora felt the heat rising to her cheeks. She considered her options. She could insist on a replacement, but the Zavran's smirk told her exactly how that would go. Instead, she took the cup and carried it to an empty table by the window, her movements controlled and deliberate. As she sat, she tried to focus on the view outside. The sprawling city stretched as far as the eye could see, its towering spires reaching toward the green-tinged sky. Hovering vehicles zipped through the air in orderly patterns, their soft hums blending into the ambient noise. It was a breathtaking sight, but Nora couldn't shake the simmering irritation in her chest. She took a sip of the coffee and winced. It was as bad as it looked, bitter and lukewarm. Setting the cup down, she glanced back at the counter, where Troll and his coworkers were whispering and chuckling. One of them glanced in her direction, and their laughter grew louder. Nora's fingers tightened around the cup. She had faced hostile aliens in negotiations, stared down enemies in battle, and made decisions that had changed the course of history. And yet, this petty, casual disdain got under her skin in a way she hadn't expected. As she sat there, her mind churned. She thought about the years she had spent fighting for respect, for peace, for equality among species. She thought about the soldiers she had led, the sacrifices they had made. And she thought about how easy it would be to stand up, confront Troll, and demand the respect she deserved. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat and waited, letting the simmering frustration settle into something more resolute. The humiliation stung, but it also lit a spark. A quiet, growing determination. She wasn't done here. Not by a long shot. Outside, the alien sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the cafe in a soft, golden light. Nora sipped her coffee again, her expression calm, her thoughts anything but. Nora sat at her table, the chipped mug resting untouched in front of her. The laughter from the counter had died down, replaced by the hum of conversation among the other patrons. She stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The lines on her face were more pronounced now, a roadmap of years spent in war zones and conference rooms. She had earned every one of them. And yet, here she was, being dismissed as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She glanced up to see Troll standing over her. A practiced smile plastered across his face. In his hands was a small tray with a delicate confection, a vibrant alien pastry that shimmered like molten metal. "I thought perhaps you'd like to try something more refined," he said, setting the tray on her table without waiting for an answer. The way he leaned slightly toward her, his height casting a shadow, felt less like a gesture of service and more like a challenge. Nora raised an eyebrow. "I didn't order this." "Oh, no charge," Troll said, his smile widening. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill. We like to ensure all our customers leave with a memorable experience." His tone was syrupy, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. He wasn't offering goodwill. He was baiting her. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, their muted conversations pausing to observe the exchange. A few chuckles rippled through the room, though she couldn't tell if they were laughing at Trellis' audacity or waiting to see her response. "I appreciate the thought," Nora said, keeping her voice steady, "but I prefer to stick with what I ordered." Trellis' smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and Nora caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said, straightening. He picked up the tray with an exaggerated flourish, turning on his heel and walking away with deliberate slowness. Nora exhaled, her grip on the edge of the table tightening. She hated how easily he was getting to her. It wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination. Not even close, but it was the casual cruelty of it that stung. This wasn't the battlefield, where hostility was clear and expected. This was supposed to be a neutral space, a place for quiet moments and simple pleasures. Yet here, too, she found herself singled out. As she stared into the murky depths of her coffee, a soft voice pulled her attention. "Excuse me." Nora looked up to see a young alien standing hesitantly by her table. They were of a species she didn't recognize. Slender, with translucent, pale blue skin that seemed to ripple faintly as they moved. Their large, luminous eyes held a nervous energy, and they clutched a small tray of empty cups to their chest. "I saw what happened," the alien said, their voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how he's treating you." Nora blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice softening. "But thank you." The alien nodded, their gaze darting nervously toward the counter where Troll and the others were still working. "He does this a lot," they said, "especially to non-Zavrans. Most people just leave." Nora studied the alien for a moment. They couldn't have been much older than 20 in human years, their posture suggesting someone used to shrinking away from confrontation. She could see the discomfort in their movements, the way they kept glancing over their shoulder. "What's your name?" Nora asked. "Jiao," the alien replied. Well, Zhao, Nora said, leaning slightly forward. Why do you stay? Zhao hesitated, their translucent skin taking on a faint violet hue that Nora recognized as a sign of embarrassment. It's a job, they said simply. Jobs are hard to come by for someone like me. Nora nodded, understanding. She'd seen it before on countless worlds, the unspoken hierarchies, the invisible barriers that kept some people at the bottom no matter how hard they worked. You shouldn't have to put up with it, Nora said. None of you should. Zhao gave a small, sad smile. It's just how things are here. Before Nora could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. Zhao. Trull's tone was curt, his expression impatient as he waved them back toward the counter. Zhao flinched, muttering a quick apology to Nora before scurrying away. Nora watched them go, a heaviness settling in her chest. She glanced around the cafe again, her gaze lingering on the faces of the patrons. Most of them had returned to their conversations, ignoring the brief exchange. But a few were still watching her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. The anger simmered just below the surface now, a slow burn that threatened to boil over. She had spent her life fighting for people like Zhao, for those who didn't have the power or privilege to stand up for themselves. And yet here she was, sitting in silence while the likes of Trull carried on unchecked. Nora's eyes drifted back to the counter, where Trull was barking orders at Zhao and the other workers. His confidence was unshaken, his smirk as self-assured as ever. He had no idea who she was, no idea of the battles she had fought and the lives she had saved. To him, she was just an aging human, a nobody. But she wasn't nobody. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't going to leave quietly. Nora took another sip of her coffee, her mind racing. She needed to think this through, to decide how best to act without letting her emotions get the better of her. She had faced bigger challenges than this, and she wasn't about to back down now. As she set the cup down, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Trull didn't know it yet, but his day was about to take a very unexpected turn. Nora sat at her table, the resolve she'd felt moments earlier solidifying into a quiet determination. She wasn't here to start a fight. Not the physical kind anyway. But she wasn't about to let Trull and his smug attitude ruin her day. She'd seen his type before, confident in their untouchable status, secure in the knowledge that no one would challenge them. It was a confidence built on layers of privilege and arrogance, and it made her blood boil. She waited, keeping her expression calm and neutral as she watched the cafe's rhythm. Trull continued his orchestrated performance at the counter, serving customers with exaggerated politeness, his tone sickly sweet in contrast to the sharp edge he had used with her. Zhao moved with quiet efficiency, their motions hurried and tense as if they feared being noticed. The other workers, a mix of alien species, seemed to orbit around Trull, their roles clear in the unspoken hierarchy. When Nora finally stood, her coat shifting slightly on her shoulders, she felt the weight of eyes on her. She approached the counter, placing the cup of coffee down with deliberate care. Trull turned toward her, his polished smile returning as if he'd been expecting her. Is there something wrong with your drink? He asked, his tone feigning concern. The way he tilted his head, the slight quirk of his brow, it was all part of the act. Nora didn't flinch. It's fine, she said, her voice steady. I was hoping I could place another order, though. Trull's smile widened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. Of course, he said, reaching for the pad that hovered at the edge of the counter. What would you like? Another coffee, Nora said. Black. Hot this time. A low chuckle rippled through the nearby patrons, and Trull's smirk deepened. He tapped on the pad with exaggerated precision. One black coffee hot, he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to invite attention. Anything else? No, Nora said. She met his gaze directly, her calm demeanor unshaken. Just that. Trull nodded, turning away with the same deliberate slowness he'd used earlier. Nora could see the tension in his shoulders now, the subtle shift in his posture as he tried to maintain his composure. She wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, and it was starting to bother him. She returned to her table, sitting with her back straight and her hands resting lightly on the surface. She let the minutes tick by, watching as Troll busied himself with other orders, making no move to fulfill hers. A few of the patrons glanced her way, their curiosity growing as the tension in the room began to build. It wasn't until nearly 10 minutes had passed that Troll finally approached her table, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He set it down in front of her with a flourish, his smile tight. "I hope this one meets your standards," he said. Nora reached for the cup, pausing just long enough to catch the flicker of amusement in Trellis' eyes. She lifted it to her lips, taking a cautious sip. The liquid was scalding, almost painfully so, and she set the cup down with deliberate care. "It's hot," she said, her tone neutral. "Thank you." Troll blinked, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. He opened his mouth to say something, but Nora was already turning her attention back to the view outside the window, dismissing him with the same casual indifference he had shown her earlier. The interaction, though brief, seemed to shift the atmosphere in the cafe. Troll's confident stride lost some of its swagger as he returned to the counter. Nora could feel the curious glances of the other patrons, some of them murmuring quietly to each other. She knew what they were thinking. She could see it in their expressions. Why didn't she just leave? Why was she still here? But Nora wasn't going anywhere. She hadn't walked away from battles far more dangerous than this, and she wasn't about to walk away now. The minutes stretched into an hour, and Nora remained seated, her presence a quiet defiance. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the heat seep into her hands. She could see Trellis, frustration growing with each passing moment, his polite facade cracking under the weight of her calm persistence. At one point, Zhao passed by her table, their arms laden with empty trays. Nora caught their eye and gave them a small nod, a silent gesture of reassurance. Zhao hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding back, their expression softening. As the cafe's rhythm continued around her, Nora's thoughts drifted to the countless hours she had spent in high-stakes negotiations, where every word, every gesture, carried weight. She had learned to read people, to find their weaknesses and exploit them when necessary. Troll was no different. His arrogance was a mask, a flimsy shield he used to protect himself from the vulnerability of being challenged. And Nora knew exactly how to dismantle it. She waited until Troll made another pass near her table before she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. Troll paused, his smile returning with forced ease. "Yes. Could you tell me the name of the manager here?" Nora asked. The question was simple, but its impact was immediate. Troll's smile wavered, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you ask?" he said, his tone cautious. "I was just wondering," Nora said, her expression neutral. "It's clear you take your work very seriously, and I'd like to share my thoughts with whoever oversees the operation." For a moment, Troll seemed at a loss for words. The confidence he had worn so easily before was slipping, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "I see," he said finally. "Well, the manager isn't here right now." "That's a shame," Nora said, leaning back in her chair. "But I'm sure I'll find a way to get in touch." Troll didn't respond immediately, and Nora could see the wheels turning in his mind. She could feel the tension radiating from him, his carefully constructed facade starting to crack under the weight of her calm persistence. As he walked away, his movements less composed than before, Nora allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Troll might not realize it, but the balance of power in the cafe was shifting, and Nora was just getting started. Nora's patience had always been her sharpest weapon. She sat at her table, calmly sipping the now lukewarm coffee, her mind whirring with the precision of a tactical plan. Troll had made his move, several in fact, and now it was her turn. She wasn't looking to make a scene. She wanted to make an impression, one he wouldn't soon forget. The cafe buzzed around her, the lull of casual conversation masking the subtle tension that her presence had stirred. Troll stayed behind the counter, his confident demeanor now a touch more rigid. His gaze flitted to her occasionally, each glance revealing a crack in his veneer. Nora caught him watching her once, and when their eyes met, she gave him a small, inscrutable smile. It was enough to make him look away, his jaw tightening. Zhao passed by her table again, carrying an armful of plates. Nora waited until they were close before she spoke, her tone just loud enough to reach them. "Zhao," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" The young alien hesitated, their large eyes darting toward the counter where Trull stood. He was busy chatting with a group of patrons, but the ever-present threat of his authority hung in the air like a storm cloud. Still, after a moment's pause, Zhao stepped closer to Nora's table, their movements tentative. "Yes?" they asked, their voice low. Nora leaned forward slightly, her expression warm but serious. "I've been where you are," she said. "I know how hard it is to work under someone who doesn't respect you." Zhao blinked, their translucent skin shimmering faintly. "I'm fine," they said quickly, the words almost reflexive. "It's just a job." "It's never just a job," Nora replied, her voice firm but kind. "You deserve better than this." Zhao looked away, their hands tightening around the plates they carried. "It doesn't matter," they murmured. "Things don't change here." "They do if someone makes them," Nora said. "You have more power than you think." Before Zhao could respond, Trellis' voice rang out across the cafe. "Zhao, are you planning to serve those plates, or have a tea party?" Zhao flinched, their skin darkening with an embarrassed flush. Without another word, they hurried away, their footsteps quick and uneven. Nora watched them go, her jaw tightening. Trellis' tone carried the kind of casual cruelty that grated on her nerves, a reminder of countless similar encounters she had witnessed in her lifetime. Her gaze shifted back to Trull, who was now leaning against the counter, laughing at something one of the patrons had said. He was back in his element, confident and self-assured, as if their earlier exchange had never happened. Nora tapped her fingers lightly on the table, considering her next move. She didn't want to escalate too quickly. This was a game of strategy, and she intended to play it well. She stood, leaving her coat draped over the back of her chair, and approached the counter. Trull noticed her immediately, his smile fading slightly as she neared. "Back for another round?" he asked, his tone light but laced with condescension. Nora placed her empty cup on the counter. "Actually, I wanted to ask about something." Trull raised an eyebrow, his expression wary. "Oh? And what might that be?" "This cafe," Nora said, gesturing to the room around them. "It's quite unique. Do you know much about its history?" Trull blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "The history?" he echoed. "Not particularly. I mean, I've worked here for a while, but it's just a job." Nora smiled faintly. "Interesting, because I happen to know quite a bit about it." Trull frowned, his posture stiffening. "And how would you know that?" "Let's just say I have a personal connection," Nora replied, her tone deliberately vague. She let the words hang in the air, watching as confusion flickered across Trull's face. Before he could press further, one of the other workers approached the counter, a nervous-looking alien with soft, furred features. They handed Trull a datapad, muttering something about inventory. Trull waved them off impatiently, his focus still on Nora. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "If you have a problem with how things are run here, maybe you should take it up with someone else. I'm just doing my job. And I'm sure you think you're doing it well," Nora said, her tone even. "But I have to wonder, do you treat all your customers the way you've treated me today?" Trull's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Nora said, her expression calm. "I'm asking a question. One that I think you already know the answer to." The tension between them was palpable now, a charged silence that drew the attention of a few nearby patrons. Trull's confident facade was slipping, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped frown. "If you have a complaint," he said finally, his voice low and clipped, "you're welcome to file it with management." "I intend to," Nora said, her gaze steady. "In fact, I'm planning to have a very thorough conversation with them." Trull's frown deepened, and for a moment, He seemed at a loss for words. Nora held his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a scene. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle him. After a long moment, Trull turned away, muttering something under his breath. Nora watched as he retreated to the back of the cafe, the datapad clutched tightly in his hand. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the other workers and patrons were now watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Returning to her table, Nora sat down and took a deep breath. The pieces were moving into place, and she was ready for the next step. Trull thought he could intimidate her, but he didn't realize the game he was playing. Nora had faced far greater challenges in her life, and she wasn't about to back down now. As she sipped her coffee, she allowed herself a small smile. The battle wasn't over yet, but she was already starting to win. The following day, the cafe was quieter than usual. The hum of conversation was subdued, and the typical clatter of plates and glasses seemed muted, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Nora sat by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside but her mind elsewhere. She had received a message that morning, an anonymous tip, though she was certain she knew the source. Someone had seen her exchange with Trull the day before, and it seemed they had been watching closely. Her plan was unfolding, piece by piece, but something still felt out of place. The tension in the air, palpable from the moment she walked in, told her that Trull was on edge. The cafe staff moved nervously, avoiding eye contact as they went about their work. Jal, she noticed, was nowhere to be seen. Nora had made a point to return today, to be sure that the day after her confrontation would serve as a reminder. She wasn't sure if it was the cold silence in the air or the strained atmosphere, but her instincts told her she was about to face the next step in this quiet battle. As she watched the door open, she saw Trull enter, his posture stiff as he crossed the threshold. His eyes flickered toward her briefly before he turned away. Nora had expected this. He was on the defensive now, unsure of how to handle her presence. For someone so used to controlling situations, he was failing to do so now. Trull's gaze briefly met hers again as he walked behind the counter. She could see the conflict in his eyes, part irritation, part anxiety. He had seen enough power moves in his life to recognize the game she was playing. But what he didn't know was that Nora was playing a much bigger game than he could ever imagine. He was merely a pawn in her plan. She rose from her seat and made her way to the counter, where he stood, fumbling with a rag as he cleaned a counter that was already spotless. His eyes briefly flickered to her before quickly averting. "What can I get you today?" Trull asked, his voice stiff and clipped. Nora smiled, but it was a thin, knowing smile. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk," she said, her voice calm but commanding. Trull blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for this. He paused for a moment, his hands freezing mid-motion, before he set the rag down and looked at her fully. "About what?" "About you," she said softly, letting the weight of the words hang in the air between them. Trull's eyebrows shot up. "About me?" He almost scoffed, though there was something less confident in his tone now. "What could you possibly want to talk about?" "I think you know," Nora said, her voice lowering, matching his earlier tone of condescension. She allowed a few seconds of silence to pass, just long enough to make him uncomfortable. She wasn't going to let him dismiss her this time. He shifted uncomfortably, stepping closer to the counter to maintain some semblance of control. "Listen," he started, his voice laced with a forced calm. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I know exactly what I'm doing," Nora interrupted. "And you need to understand something. What happened yesterday?" She paused to let the weight of her words settle. "It wasn't an accident." Trull's eyes flickered, his unease becoming more obvious by the second. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that I know exactly who you are, Trull," Nora said, her voice calm, but her words cutting deep. "And I'm not one to be messed with." He stared at her for a long moment, his confusion shifting to realization. "I don't know what you think you know, but this," he gestured vaguely toward the cafe. "This is my place. I run things here. You think I'm scared of a disgruntled customer?" "No," Nora said, her voice suddenly sharp. But you should be scared of me. His eyes widened slightly, disbelief flashing across his face. For a moment, Nora thought he might actually laugh. But he didn't. Instead, he turned his head, his eyes darting around the cafe as if looking for a way out of the conversation. But there was no escape, not this time. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Nora continued, her gaze unwavering. I'm not just another patron here to make your life difficult. I'm someone who can make your life disappear. Trull blinked, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I'm not playing games with you, she said, her voice a low, controlled whisper now. I run things too, and I've been keeping an eye on you. I've seen the way you treat the staff, the way you treat everyone. Her voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. And I can make sure that you don't get away with it. Trull took a step back, his face draining of color. You don't know who you're messing with, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. This is a business. You think I'm afraid of you? Nora leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on the counter. I think you should be. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe fell into an uneasy silence, the murmurs of patrons seeming distant and irrelevant compared to the tension between the two of them. Finally, Trull broke the silence, his voice low and defensive. I don't know who you are, but you're clearly out of your depth here. He straightened, his posture growing rigid again, though it was clear that something inside him had shifted. He was no longer the confident man who had confronted her the day before. He was rattled, trying to piece together what was happening. He wasn't in control anymore. Nora's smile widened just slightly, knowing that the tables had turned. I think you're about to find out exactly who I am. With that, she stepped back from the counter, turning toward the exit. But as she reached the door, she paused. She turned back to look at him one last time. You'll be hearing from me soon, she said, her voice dripping with the weight of her words. As she left the cafe, Nora felt the heavy presence of power settle back into her bones. She wasn't just a customer, not anymore. She was the storm, and Trull was about to feel the full force of it. The next few days were filled with a quiet kind of tension. Nora could feel the weight of it every time she passed the cafe, every time she walked through the district. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for her to notice the changes. The workers who used to greet her with polite indifference now avoided her gaze. They didn't look her in the eye, didn't acknowledge her presence unless absolutely necessary. It was as if they knew something had shifted, though they didn't fully understand what it was. Nora hadn't been back to the cafe since her conversation with Trull. She didn't need to. She knew the ball was in his court now, and it was only a matter of time before he cracked. The pressure had already started to build, and she could feel it with every passing hour. It wasn't long before she got the message. It came through her encrypted channel. A simple, terse text that sent a ripple of anticipation through her. Meet me tonight, Café. The message was from Zhao, the young worker who had been so visibly shaken by Trull's behavior the other day. It wasn't the kind of message Nora had expected, but it made sense. Zhao had seen more than enough to know what was going on. She arrived at the cafe a few minutes before closing time. The last of the customers were finishing up, leaving the place eerily quiet. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the tables. Nora's footsteps echoed in the otherwise empty room as she stepped inside. She didn't see Trull, but she knew he was nearby. He had to be. His presence always lingered in the background, even when he wasn't physically present. Zhao was waiting for her by the counter, nervously fiddling with a napkin. The young worker looked up as Nora approached, their face pale and drawn. You came, Zhao said quietly, voice trembling. Of course, Nora replied, her tone steady. What's going on? Zhao glanced nervously over their shoulder, then leaned in close, speaking in a whisper. Trull, he's been acting strange. More than usual. He's paranoid, and he's been watching me like a hawk. I don't know what's going on, but it feels like he knows something, like he's expecting trouble. Good, Nora said, her voice cold. He should be expecting trouble. Jal nodded but still looked worried. I don't know what he's planning, but it's bad. He's already started making changes around here. Moving people around, changing shifts. He's trying to get rid of anyone he thinks might side with you. Nora's eyes narrowed. This was exactly what she'd been anticipating. Troll wasn't just taking her challenge lying down. He was retaliating, making moves to tighten his control. But he didn't know the kind of forces he was up against. Has he tried anything else? Nora asked, her voice low. Not yet, Jal said, shaking their head. But I'm scared. I've seen how he treats people who step out of line. Then it's time to show him what happens when someone steps out of line, Nora said firmly, her mind already working through the next steps. Jal looked uncertain, but something in Nora's voice seemed to steal their resolve. What do we do now? Nora smiled faintly. Now, we make him regret ever thinking he could intimidate anyone in this cafe. She turned toward the back of the cafe, where the storage rooms and employee offices were. She could feel Jal's gaze on her as she walked, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Jal was already starting to understand what this was about. Power, leverage, and strategy. As they reached the door to the staff area, Nora stopped and glanced over at Jal. You'll need to stay out of sight for this, she said, her voice a little softer. I can't guarantee what happens next. I don't want you caught in the middle. Jal nodded quickly, their eyes wide. I understand. I'll wait out here. Nora gave them a reassuring look before pushing the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was still, almost suffocating. The smell of cleaning supplies and the faint hum of machines filled the air. Troll had a small office at the back, and she could hear faint noises coming from the other side of the room. Papers shuffling, something heavy being moved. She knew he was in there. She didn't knock. Instead, she opened the door wide and stepped inside. Troll looked up, startled. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the arrogance that had once defined him faltered. He hadn't expected this. She could see it in his expression. You again, he muttered, his voice tight. Don't sound so surprised, Nora replied, her tone smooth but commanding. I did say I'd be back. He stood slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. His posture was defensive, almost instinctive, as if he was bracing for something. But he didn't say anything else. He just stared at her, his jaw clenched. I gave you a chance, Nora said, stepping closer. I offered you an out, and yet here we are. Trellis' eyes narrowed. What is it you want from me? Everything, Nora said simply, her gaze unflinching. I want you to understand the consequences of underestimating people. You've been treating this place like your personal empire, but it's not. It's a business, and I'm the one who runs it. Trellis' face contorted with confusion and frustration. What are you talking about? You're just some. I'm the owner. Nora cut him off, her voice sharp. This cafe is mine, Troll, and I've been letting you run it into the ground. But no more. The color drained from Trellis' face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stumbled back, almost tripping over the chair behind him. His shock was palpable, and for the first time since she'd met him, Nora saw him truly rattled. You can't, Troll started, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I'm not here to discuss your ignorance, Nora said coldly. I'm here to make you understand your place, and that's beneath me. She stepped forward, her gaze locking onto his. She could see the fear creeping into his eyes now, and it felt satisfying. The power had shifted, and it was as clear to him as it was to her. Troll opened his mouth to say something else, but she raised a hand to silence him. I'm done giving you chances, she said. This is your final warning. Nora turned on her heel and left the room, the door closing with a soft click behind her. As she passed the staff area, Jal was waiting in the hallway, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Is it done? They whispered. For now, Nora said, her smile a little tighter than before. For now, he knows who's really in charge. As she stepped out of the back area and into the main part of the cafe, She could feel the eyes of the workers on her, the palpable tension in the air. This was just the beginning. Trull had underestimated her, and now he would learn exactly how big a mistake that had been. But she wasn't finished yet. There was more to do, more to claim. The next day, the tension in the cafe was almost unbearable. The workers moved with mechanical precision, their eyes cast downward, avoiding any interaction with Trull or, worse, with Nora. The news had already spread. The owner had come back, and things were about to change. There was a certain electric charge in the air that hummed through the room, a feeling that something monumental was just waiting to unfold. Nora sat at her usual spot by the window, watching the street outside. Her fingers drummed lightly against the table, the rhythmic sound a counterpoint to the dissonance she could feel building inside. She had done what she came to do, asserting her dominance in a way that left no room for doubt. But she could feel the shift in the dynamics. Trull was rattled, but he wasn't done. She knew him better than that. He wouldn't take this lying down, no matter how much he feared the consequences. As if on cue, the door to the cafe opened with a jarring chime. Nora's eyes flickered toward it, and her breath caught for just a second. It was Trull, but this time he wasn't alone. He was flanked by two of his regulars, the men who had always been in his corner, the ones who had reinforced his dominance over the cafe staff. They were big, broad-shouldered, and imposing, the kind of men who made people step aside without a word. Trull walked in with his usual air of superiority, but today there was something darker in his eyes, something that spoke of frustration, perhaps even fear. He moved past the counter, heading straight for the back office without acknowledging anyone, his entourage trailing behind him like shadows. The workers exchanged quick, nervous glances, but none dared to speak. Nora knew what this meant. Trull was planning something, and she needed to act fast before he could rally any more support. She stood up from her seat, the decision already made. The time for subtlety was over. The back office door slammed open as Nora strode down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The men at the counter looked up, eyes widening when they saw her, but none of them moved. Nora didn't slow down. She was on a mission. When she reached the office door, she didn't bother to knock. She pushed it open with a swift motion, startling Trull and his companions. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them crackled with the tension of two predators circling one another, both trying to figure out the next move. Trull was the first to break the silence. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" he said, his voice dripping with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This is my cafe, my place. You think you can just waltz in here and take control? I think it's you who doesn't understand your place," Nora said, her voice calm, but every word laced with intent. She could see the flash of recognition in his eyes as her words cut through his bravado. His posture stiffened, and his companions shifted uncomfortably behind him. The two men flanking Trull looked at each other, then at Nora. Neither of them made a move. They were calculating, trying to decide if they should step in. But something in Nora's gaze held them back. She didn't need to raise her voice. The control she wielded was silent, measured, and it was far more dangerous than any physical confrontation. "I've let you think you run things here, Trull," Nora continued, her tone icy now. "But make no mistake, this cafe is mine, and your days of playing games are over." Trull's face twisted in fury. "You think I'm just going to roll over for you? You don't know me. You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know exactly what you're capable of," Nora said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "You've been treating people like garbage for too long. It's time for someone to show you what happens when you cross the wrong person." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching for something on the desk. Maybe a weapon, maybe just a pen. It didn't matter. Nora was already a step ahead. With a swift motion, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it, forcing him to release whatever he was holding. His eyes widened in shock as the pain hit him, but Nora didn't flinch. She held him there, the power dynamic shifting dramatically. The once cocky Trull was now a man with his arm held painfully behind his back. "You're not the one in charge here," Nora said, her voice low and dangerous. And I'll make sure you never forget that. The two men behind Troll stepped forward, but Nora was already one step ahead. She didn't even have to raise her voice. The power she wielded, the confidence that came with the control she had, made them hesitate. It was clear now that they weren't sure where their loyalties lay. The balance of power had shifted, and they could feel it. Troll, face contorted with frustration and pain, finally managed to wrench his arm free. He staggered back, breathing heavily. But there was a fire in his eyes now, a mix of rage and something deeper, something desperate. "This isn't over," he spat, his words sharp and venomous. "You think you can walk in here and take what's mine? You'll regret this. You'll all regret this." Nora didn't respond immediately. She watched him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. She could see the fear creeping into his eyes, beneath the bravado. She knew she had him. "You'll regret it first," she said coldly. "I'll make sure of it." Without another word, Nora turned and walked out of the office. Her heels clicked on the tile floor with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the empty cafe. She could hear Troll muttering to his men, but she didn't turn back. She didn't need to. Her message had been delivered. Outside, the cold night air hit her face like a slap, but it was invigorating, a sharp contrast to the tension inside the cafe. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. This was just the beginning. Troll may have thought he could intimidate her, but now he knew who was really in charge. She wasn't just an owner. She was a force, and she would make sure everyone knew it. As she walked away from the cafe, she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Troll would retaliate. He tried to fight back, to reclaim his ground. But Nora was ready for whatever came next. And when the time came, she would be the one to finish what she started. The next few days felt like a waiting game for Nora. She knew Troll wouldn't give up easily. He wasn't that kind of man. His pride had been wounded, and that was dangerous. But Nora wasn't just sitting back and hoping for the best. No, she was planning, calculating. She needed to be 2 steps ahead at all times. She had begun to notice subtle changes in the way people acted toward her. Mostly the staff. There was a shift in their demeanor, a kind of unease that hadn't been there before. They were no longer scared of Troll, but they were wary of her. They didn't know what she would do next, and that made them uneasy. Still, none of them were willing to speak openly. It was as though they were waiting for someone else to take the first step. Jal, on the other hand, had become more vocal. They approached Nora after her second visit, looking more determined and confident. "We need to take action now," Jal said quietly, as though speaking too loudly would get them caught. Nora glanced at them, assessing the situation. "What are you suggesting?" Jal hesitated. "You've already shown him who's in charge, but I think there's more we can do. We can't just wait for him to make the first move. If we're really going to push him out, we have to take control not just of the cafe, but of his operation. His people, his allies. They need to know they have no protection." Nora was silent for a moment, the wheels turning in her head. Jal was right. This wasn't about just running the cafe anymore. This was about sending a message that would make Troll's position untenable. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice steady. "We need leverage. Something that will force him to step down without him realizing it. We need to cut off his support piece by piece. People need to know he's no longer the one they should be following. That's how we win this." Nora nodded, impressed. "All right," she said slowly. "Let's do it." The plan wasn't a simple one. It required coordination with several key staff members and, most importantly, getting Trellis' close-knit allies to turn on him. It would take time, but the foundation had been laid. Now it was all about building the right pressure. They started by working with the workers who had quietly begun to resist Trellis' authority. Some of them had been afraid to speak out until they saw Nora's determination. Others were more cautious, but Jal had become an unexpected ally in rallying them. The first step was small, shifting the power dynamics in the cafe. Jal began offering different shifts to employees who had been mistreated, making them feel valued again. Nora began offering new incentives, a better pay structure, and more autonomy to the workers who were loyal to her cause. In return, they would provide intel on Trolls' activities and movements. At the same time, Nora began working on undermining Trolls' control over his inner circle. She knew his relationship with his two main supporters was fragile. They weren't as loyal to him as he believed. Troll had relied on intimidation and fear to keep them in check. But that foundation was crumbling. Nora reached out to one of them, a man named Malik, who was known for his quiet, calculating demeanor. They met in a discreet location, away from the cafe. Nora leaned in, her voice steady. "You don't need him anymore, Malik. Trolls not the power here. You can see that now." Malik looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to realize that your future doesn't lie with him," Nora said. "You've been working under a tyrant, but you're smarter than that. You've got potential. If you stand with me, I'll make sure you have more than Troll could ever offer." For a long moment, Malik didn't speak. Nora didn't press. She let the silence hang between them, letting him stew over her words. Finally, Malik exhaled and gave a single nod. It was a small victory, but it was significant. If Malik had turned, the others would soon follow. And with Trolls' closest allies starting to doubt his leadership, it wouldn't be long before his position became untenable. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Nora received an unexpected visit from one of the cafe's regulars. An older woman named Clara who had always been friendly but distant. She had been coming to the cafe for years, always sitting at the same table near the back, quietly observing. Nora had never spoken much to Clara, but the woman's presence was a constant. Clara wasn't exactly influential, but she had something that Troll had never considered: credibility. "I hear there's trouble in paradise," Clara said, her voice low but tinged with concern as she approached Nora one morning while the cafe was quiet. Nora raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "The cafe, Troll. I've been coming here long enough to see when things are off," Clara said, sitting down at the table. "And from what I see now, things are about to get worse for him." Nora leaned in, intrigued. "What do you know?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've seen how he treats the staff. I know things aren't what they seem, and I know you're not as powerless as you appear." Nora studied her for a moment, considering the implications. Clara wasn't a worker, but she had eyes and ears all over the cafe. She had heard things, seen things. She could be a valuable ally. "I don't want to see anyone suffer," Clara said softly. "But I've seen Troll do things to people that, well, that's not the kind of man he should be. And if you really want him gone, you'll need more than just the staff. You need the customers to see it, too. The regulars." Nora realized what Clara was suggesting. The cafe was more than just a place of work. It was a community. If she could turn the regulars, the ones who had supported Troll without question, against him, the impact would be catastrophic. It would be the final nail in the coffin for his control. "We'll start small," Nora said, her eyes narrowing with determination. "I'll speak to the regulars, make them see who he really is, and then we'll move in for the kill." Clara gave a slow nod. "Be careful. He's not the kind of man who'll just walk away. But you've got the right idea. If anyone can take him down, it's you." Nora smiled faintly. "And I intend to." The final phase of her plan was beginning. She had turned the tide, and now the endgame was in sight. Troll had no idea what was coming for him, but Nora would make sure he learned the hard way that no one could stand against her. Not when she had the power to destroy everything he had built. The next move would be hers, and this time it wouldn't just be about the cafe. It would be about reclaiming control of everything. The day Troll's downfall came was almost anticlimactic. It wasn't a grand confrontation, nor a fiery showdown. It was a quiet, deliberate process, the kind of slow burn that left no room for escape. Nora had spent the last week gathering her allies, securing her position, and laying the groundwork for the final strike. She'd done what needed to be done. She'd turned the staff, she'd convinced his closest allies to walk away, and she'd rallied the regulars who had once supported him to speak out. Troll had no idea what was coming. The cafe was unusually busy this morning, the chatter of customers mingling with the hum of the espresso machine. Nora sat near the window, sipping her coffee, her eyes scanning the room with a calculated coolness. She had been here before, in this place of control, but today felt different. The air seemed charged with anticipation, a sense that something was about to shift permanently. Zhao appeared at her side, their face serious but oddly satisfied. It's done. The regulars are all on our side. Malik has already started talking to the others. They'll be in place by the time he gets here. Nora nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good. Now we wait. As if on cue, the door swung open, and Trull walked in, his usual air of authority masking the nervous tension that lingered in his stiff movements. He was flanked by two of his remaining loyalists, but there was something off about the way they carried themselves. They weren't walking with their usual arrogance, and they didn't look at Nora when they entered, a subtle but telling sign of how far the power had shifted. Trull's eyes scanned the cafe, landing on Nora almost immediately, his jaw clenched. He had probably been expecting her to come to him, to make another demand, but instead, she was sitting calmly at her table, a picture of control. He approached her slowly, his footsteps heavy. What is this? His voice was sharp, but there was a tremor in it, a slight quiver that betrayed his frustration. Nora didn't stand up. She didn't need to. She was in no hurry. This, she said coolly, is your downfall. Trull's face reddened with anger, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he looked at the crowd of regulars who were sitting nearby, who had been whispering amongst themselves in hushed tones as he entered. He could feel the change, the shift in the energy around him, but he couldn't place it yet. What have you done? Nora's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nous sommes permanents. Just made sure your little empire here was ready to crumble. You built it on fear, Trull, and fear isn't a foundation that lasts. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of chairs scraping against the floor cut him off. One by one, the regulars, the ones who had been silent for so long, stood up. The cafe's energy shifted. The air that had once been suffocating with tension was now heavy with defiance. It wasn't just Nora who had turned the tide. It was the entire community that had backed her up. I'm sorry, Trull, one of the regulars said. He had been coming to the cafe for years, his gruff exterior hiding a man who had grown tired of being cowed by the likes of Trull. But you've been running this place wrong for a long time, another customer chimed in. The way you treat the staff, the way you talk down to everyone. It's not right. Trull's eyes darted between them, confusion flooding his expression as his loyalists shifted uncomfortably at his side. They were wavering now, the cracks in his control wide enough for even the most devoted to see. They could feel the power slipping from his grasp. Nora stood now, her movements slow and deliberate. She stepped toward him, her eyes never leaving his. You've always thought you were in control, haven't you? You thought no one could touch you. But that's the thing about power built on fear, it's fragile. All it takes is one push and it crumbles. Trull's gaze flickered to Malik, the one person he thought he could trust. But Malik wasn't looking at him. He wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands shoved into his pockets as if he didn't want to be part of this anymore. You've lost them, Nora said, her voice low and steady. You've lost all of them. Trull opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stood frozen, like a man who had just realized that the world he built was slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. The cafe was eerily silent now, except for the soft clink of cups and plates. The regulars, the workers, and even the occasional stranger had all witnessed the collapse of Trull's reign. Nora had done it. She had taken back what was hers, and in doing so had exposed the brittle foundation of his power. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Trull took a step back. His face was pale, his mouth drawn tight with anger and disbelief. You won't get away with this, he spat, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. Nora's smile was small, almost pitying. I already have. She turned to the staff, who had gathered around, watching the scene unfold. You're free now, she said, her voice carrying across the room. You no longer have to answer to him. I've made sure of that. There was a collective exhale as the tension that had built up over the weeks finally broke. The cafe felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. The workers, who had been silent for so long, started to speak to each other, to share quiet, relieved smiles. Trellis' absence wouldn't just be felt here. It would echo throughout every part of his operation. The influence he'd once wielded now scattered to the wind. As Trull made his way to the door, muttering curses under his breath, Nora felt a strange sense of closure. This battle, the one for control, had been fought in whispers and glances, in the quietest of movements. And now it was over. When the door closed behind him, the cafe seemed to breathe again. The workers, the regulars, everyone had just witnessed something rare, something powerful. The cafe was theirs once again. Nora stood there for a moment, surveying the room, feeling the weight of her victory settle into her bones. She had done it. Trull was gone, and her reign had begun. But more than that, she had shown them all what it meant to reclaim power. The next chapter had just begun.